Emma Ruby-Sachs, is a writer, lawyer, and executive director of SumOfUs, a global movement of over 15 million members worldwide, where we are thrilled to sit down with Emma to discuss ways to create an inclusive and purpose-filled workplace as we inch closer to a new post-pandemic reality. Boy, am I looking forward to that. I believe we have a video clip here we can show you, so you can take a little glimpse at 10 of SumOfUs, the campaign victories from 2020. So let's take a look at the clip.
Thank you, Hunter. And I love that video. I can't believe all of the incredible things that SumOfUs has done over the past year, which is incredible. But thank you for being here, Emma. And I want to just kind of start by letting you give us a little more insight into what SumOfUs is and what you do at SumOfUs.
Yeah, and I wish I could play you guys the jaunty music that went along with that video, but it was extremely upbeat, as you can imagine. No, SumOfUs, we're actually over 18 million now because we're growing pretty quickly around the world and expanding in languages everywhere as well. But the deal with SumOfUs is that we're essentially a people-powered movement. So people from all over the world donate to us in small amounts, and that's what pays for all of the work that you just saw and everything we do otherwise. So if we're launching a legal challenge or taking an ad out in a newspaper or paying staff salaries, almost all that money comes from individual members who donate from around the world. And then also members' voices kind of power the campaign. So we get meetings with corporate headquarters because hundreds of thousands of people have signed a petition or sent messages or tweeted about something. And it's kind of the power of democratic legitimacy. And some of that campaigning, that was just from the first year I was in the job. So I took this, I've only been in it for a year and a half, although I've been campaigning for a lot longer. That was just some of the stuff we did in the first year, but it was also the year of COVID. So we did some other amazing stuff, like our tech team built the first ever global COVID support network, which allowed people to give and offer and ask for support from all over the world. Most of those were very local, and it hit everything from language instruction for kids, Venezuela to the US or France to Canada, to direct appeals for financial assistance. And then we facilitated tens of thousands of microgrants between some members and other members so they could actually directly support each other during the crisis. And that was just a very cool thing that was built super quickly in the middle of the COVID. We also did a global music video where we had an original song written for a community. And then there was this portal built that allowed us to upload videos of music recording quality for our members. And then it all got put together into a global music video during COVID. So it was also a really cool moment where our team came together and started iterating and experimenting with how we can connect online, not just to win campaigns, but also to create community.
And what do you do, Emma, at the company?
I'm the executive director, so I do a little bit of everything. One of the things I said when I took the job is I only want this job if I get to spend a third of my time actually campaigning. So that's what I do a lot of the time, is designing campaigns, writing emails, figuring out what the legal strategy will be on something, getting deep with the tech team and figuring out what we're going to build next, figuring out what our testing data says. But I also, do management and fundraising and all that boring stuff that happens when you're the ED of something.
I love it. It's all so important and kind of leads us into this next question. And we chatted a bit about this in the green room, but where are you based? And how did you first become interested in DEI and, more importantly, advocacy? Why was that so important for you to be boots on the ground, campaigning, and, in the thick of all of this great work that y'all are doing?
So I'm based in Chicago by accident of falling in love with a woman from Chicago, but I'm Canadian, from Toronto. And how did I get into this? I was a constitutional appellate lawyer, and which I thought was my dream job. And I realized very quickly that the people who showed up, even if we won their case, the people who showed up at the law firm, their lives were already ruined because the system just kind of eats you up and spits you out. And you may win 1 or 2 landmark cases in your lifetime, maybe 3 if you're lucky. And you don't get to do this wide systematic change. And so I quit. And I wrote everyone I knew who was interesting. I said, I'm looking for a job. I have no idea what it should be. And a friend of mine wrote back and said, there's this small startup campaigning organization that's very quietly hiring. And I stayed at that. It was an organization called Avaz, and I stayed there for 10 years. And when I joined, there were 20 staff, and when I left, there were 120 staff, and our budget was 10 times the amount. And so that was an amazing. I started at the entry level position and worked my way up to deputy director, and I got to do all the ins and outs of campaigning. So, that's what got me into it, and now I'm totally hooked. It's like a drug.
Totally get it. I feel like we're at that hyper growth stage at Power to Fly, and it's the most fun of any startup, I will say. But let's talk about SumOfUs a little bit. And you mentioned this in the intro, but SumOfUs is over 18 million people stopping big corporations from behaving badly. I love that. What more can you tell us about SumOfUs, your mission, and some of your current initiatives?
Yeah, there's so much that was interesting about. So I inherited a lot of the organization, but there's 2 things that I really think are amazing about the way we do things. One is that we're really viciously focused on impact. So everything we do, from every meeting we have, every dollar that's spent, it's the question we ask ourselves is, what is this impacting? So that means that some organizations maybe invest a lot more in brand, which is an important thing to invest in, but you have to be able to make the argument for why you're deciding to invest in brand in terms of impact in the world and making things better, reducing corporate influence and increasing accountability to people. So I think that's a really amazing thing about the organization. And that's the thing that ops, HR, tech, campaigns, we all sort of focus on. And it brings us together as one team. There's not that division that you see in a lot of teams, I think. The other thing about it is that the organization really lives its values in a way that I think is really impressive. And this isn't me, this is the founder who organized it this way. But for example, our skills chart that you're rated on includes an entire section on anti-oppression and how you're pursuing our anti-oppression values and implementing them both in the organization and outside in the world. And so a lot of the things that organizations do around DEI and diversity amongst staff is deeply supported in the internal and the external work. And I think that's really unusual to be able to stand up and say, what I'm trying to achieve in the world, I'm also working really hard and achieving internally as well as an organization.
I love that. And I just hosted a panel with founders talking about, the value of working at and founding a mission-driven company. And, it's really important for so many different factors. But I love that that's a big piece of SumOfUs too. So let's talk about mistakes that you see corporations making. So, what's the most common mistake you see when they're attempting to make their offices more inclusive? And really going back to that mission-driven, company bit. I feel like mission-driven companies are really good at doing this, but I'm sure you've seen a lot of mistakes along the way.
Yeah, I think first of all, to recognize this is not a mistake they make, but I think it's an important thing of right now that a lot of people that I speak to, and I think the majority of the sort of emerging and middle level established workforce really cares about there being purpose in their job. And you can kind of imagine why, right? There's so many fewer safeguards out there in the world for us now. So if we're going to be putting everything on the line and spending our days at work, we need to know that we're doing it for something bigger than the remuneration we're being offered and the retirement that we are going to desperately try and save for. And I think that that's just got to do with, if you have lack of security, you start showing up for work for other reasons. So I really value that I get to go to a place every day that feels like it fills me up with a sense of purpose and mission. And I think the mistake that corporations make, I find it's the inconsistency, and this is really tough, right? But I think what happens is that a corporation will, like, let's say racial justice, they'll make a big statement about Black Lives Matter when there's a protest, because they feel like that's what their customers want them to do, and also staff usually within the organization. And then when you make that kind of statement, people are going to start looking at, well, who do you donate to? And what are you invested in? And how are your staff internally treated? And the thing is, it's a lot easier to make statements than it is to fix all those other more institutionalized problems. And that's the big mistake I see. And so I think that the answer is not to not make the statements. The answer is to kind of lean into all the other stuff. And that's my philosophy, is like very much to lean into it. If it's tough, we should be talking about it and working on it. It needs to take up time and attention. And so far it's worked amazingly. Our work is so much more efficient and impactful because we're taking time to discuss these tough issues and not just run campaigns on them.
I love that. And that really nicely ties into this next question, which is, another hot topic that a lot of companies and hiring managers, recruiters are talking about, but it's that importance of culture fit. And I want to dive into mission fit or values fit. Do you think this is something that companies should pay more attention to? And if so, how can they include this in their hiring and, almost more importantly, their retention processes?
Yeah, I mean, look, culture fit is an incredibly dangerous term, I think. There's a whole study on how law firms use culture fit to reject women and people of color from positions. Or like, if you've ever heard of the infamous airport test, like, would you want to be stuck in an airport with person X? And then they talk about that in the recruiting room. So we don't talk about culture fit, and I don't like talking about culture fit, but I think mission fit is a huge thing. It's one of the things we ask in our first interview questions all the time. Like, most people who work at Some of Us could be getting paid a lot more to work somewhere else that wasn't mission driven. And so there's something inside them that happened to them or they experienced that has caused them to make this shift from, seeking out the most advanced and highest paying job to a job that's going to have the most impact in the world. And what I find is that the people who succeed are the ones who can really articulate the personal story of why they're there. For some people, it's like they fell into a campaign because a friend or they were a victim in some way of something when they were young, and then they won, and then they get the bug. For other people, it's because of their personal identity, experience of their family. For me, it's just like I was a super lonely kid who got bullied a lot. and I was a big nerd. And so this idea of being able to kind of come together and fight against the bullies of the world was really inspiring to me.
And I wonder how you kind of sniff out the red flags there, because be it that it is, such a hard question, and companies, I think, tackle it very differently. How do y'all sniff out the people that are actually, committed to the mission versus maybe just talking about, its importance from a very surface level?
Yeah. I think that there's a couple of things we do. The first is that the hiring process is really long. And involves multiple interviews and an activity that you have to do that gets graded in real time. So it's not easy. You have to really be committed to going through the process. And it tests a lot of different skill levels, including, your ability to write, your ability to come up with strategy, your ability to think on your feet and speak on your feet. So all those things help, because why would you do that if you didn't really care deeply? But then we also have a bunch of questions around the ways in which you've already done research in your life on systems of oppression and how they show up in your personal life, in your professional life, and in the world. And so you kind of figure out who's been paying attention, who's been reading and researching, and who's incorporated some of those lessons. And you don't make it onto the team unless you have a certain facility with those issues. And I find you don't go out, especially tough stuff like racism, you don't go out and read about that and think about it if you don't have to. Or if it's not like core to your beliefs as a human being. And then that gives us a good proxy for who is going to really soar and succeed on the team.
So true, and such good points. And kind of talking about the flip side of the coin here, many employees might not know about some of the negative actions their companies might be taking, especially in regards to the tough issues. Let's talk about climate change, for example. How can employees pressure their companies to be more transparent?
I love this question because actually one of the things we work on a lot and did during the 2020 election, and we are continuing to work on, is disinformation and misinformation and online manipulation, especially from the big tech companies. And one of the wonderful things we're learning is that it's employee pressure that's creating a lot of the corporation-led change that is happening. It's not sufficient, but there's a lot of change happening. And it's because these companies are terrified of losing that mission-driven group of people who are high talent, who have been there for, let's say, a few years and are starting to realize that the cool pitch they were shown in college or at a grad school may not be everything that's going on in the company. And even whispers of employee discontent can cause a company to really turn to the left on something. So it's a strategy we're pursuing more, being able to get in touch with employees of companies and help them express their views to leadership. But I feel like as an employee, you sometimes don't realize how much of an effect you have. And especially now when it's a labor first market and people are really desperate for talented folks to work at their organizations, you got more power than you ever could imagine at freaking management out. So a hat tip for the idea of employee activism and trying to push for your corporation to live its values. And then the other thing is, this is sort of dovetailed with another element, but one thing is ask questions. And the thing that's dovetailed with is unionization. Some of us as a staff union, a lot of places are unionizing now. If you're scared to ask questions as an individual, if you are unionized, you can ask questions. And it allows you to do so. Also making sure there's an anonymous forum where that can happen. And then the questions don't have to be accusatory. They can just be things like, hey, we'd like to see the investments that you're making, or we want to know, what you're doing on this thing you said you'd work on last year. And just those sorts of slight nudges, especially if they're maybe combined with public attention on the issue in the company, can make a huge difference. So that's been a big eye opener for me, is how much employees can actually make a difference in very, very big companies, not just really small ones.
My dad is the business manager of Local 35. So I
didn't know that when I made the union plug. But I am named after Emma Goldman, who my father, who thought when I was a kid, and he agreed to sponsor my soccer team when I was 8. Everyone else's parents put their little whatever logo on or something. And my dad just had anarchy written across the front of all of our soccer jerseys. I've never been so mortified in my life. But anyway, that gives you a hint into my background.
Yes, I love it. But I mean, you bring up such a good point. And, it's a theme that we've kind of been talking about in a lot of these conversations, which is, the imposter syndrome, or the fear that we have as people, as employees, to really, step up and, is what I have to say even going to reach the people? It doesn't matter. So I think that, that's amazing what y'all are doing to really help and support and, move these, I hate to say like small voices, but, the small voices that matter forward. It's so powerful.
Thank you.
So I have one more question, and I'd love to, open it up to the audience if there are any questions from y'all. But I want to talk about this post-pandemic era. And as many people are returning to in-person work, and I commented that you are in a live office, that's not a virtual background, which is so cool. What practices do you hope that companies retain from the pandemic era? And how can we not let DEI fall by the wayside as we return back to normal?
This is a good question. And I just want to say that I think that I don't know the answer of how you get DEI not to fall by the wayside, because I feel like I tried a lot of soft methods to do that in many experiences and failed in my work history. And the reason why I think it works now at SumOfUs is because there's not an option. I mean, it's written into essentially the staff contract. So you have no choice but to pursue it. And I think that in a way, having that organizationally might be the only solution that I know of. Because it's hard, and the best leaders and the best staff members will want to not do it sometimes when it gets hard, from any background. So yeah, I think I wish I had a better answer than that. But I think the answer is it's got to be written in there. And if it's not written in there, there's just no guarantee that it's going to be pursued. And yeah, and I failed multiple times to pursue it when it wasn't written in there. And I feel like I'm being pushed by the organization to be better because it's a rule. And I like rules because I'm trained as a lawyer. So maybe that's my bias on that front. In terms of post-pandemic, I mean, I think, first of all, this isn't a thing for me because I've worked this way for a long time, but working from home or remote work or work flexibility, hours flexibility, flexibility for parents, all that kind of stuff. Like, our philosophy at SumOfUs is if you get the work done, that's what matters. And we have great vacation and great sick pay and all that kind of stuff. But most important for us is like, what impact did you have this year? That's the thing we ask. And we have these quarterly reviews. What impact did you have in the last 3 months? And if you knock off because your kid needs to be picked up from school, like, nobody's going to care. So I think there's that. And letting people work from where they are and letting people within reason move around. We had people who moved to help care for sick parents and loved ones over the course of the pandemic. So I think that flexibility and that real centering on the care work that we all do and we all need in our lives. And then that work flexibility, I think, is big. And then the other thing that I realized in the pandemic is sometimes you need to meet in person. And you will save money by not having a central office or by only having one instead of one for everywhere your staff is, and by hiring multiple places. And so spend some of that money on getting together, because I have only met my team once in a year and a half, and it wasn't even all of them. And it was when I started. And that's hard. And I can't wait till we're in a room again together and we can really brainstorm together and work together in person.
I love that you said that. We had our first in-person gathering here at Power to Fly in a year, like you said, and it was a beautiful, was not long enough, let's just say. So I love that, think about the money you're saving and invest that in gatherings. That's a really good piece of advice. And Linda has a great question in the chat that kind of touches upon a lot of the things that we've talked about in the last 30 minutes. And that is, how do you convince your team or your manager to have work inclusiveness as an agenda? So if you're not a manager, if you're an individual contributor, how do you force that issue upwards?
I think this is a really tough question. I think there's very few models available out there, but to the extent that there are models to offer, and there's a big question here about whose burden it should be to go out and find these models and generate them for organizations. So I'm putting that in context of it probably shouldn't be the staff who will be most benefited by this, who have to go out and do that. But by providing concrete models and a pathway towards it, you also create accountability if it's not done. So it's one thing to be like, you have to pursue inclusiveness, you have to pursue DI, here's what it looks like. And how do you know what it looks like if you don't have benchmarks that are in there? So for example, one of our benchmarks is that any search we're looking for somebody to join the team, if the final pool of qualified candidates is not a diverse pool, it's considered a failed search. That's a rule versus somebody being like, I want a diverse team. In which case, how do you do that in a way that is A, legal, and B, effective? Without those sort of benchmarks, you look up and next thing you know, you don't have a diverse team and no one knows why. So I think those models and those guidelines are really important, and being able to source those is really helpful. And then I think it's hard. I think that it's a lot of work, and nobody really, not nobody, but lots of people don't know what they're doing and they don't know how to do it. And they get the option of opting out because there is always this memory of business as usual. So in a way, we're in this wonderful moment where business as usual isn't quite acceptable, and organizing to really force people to start adopting these kinds of rules, I think, is the pathway forward. But it's tough. You can't do it alone. You need other staff to sign on with you, and you need that support. I haven't yet found a place that can provide that kind of like, these are the concrete things, but we use coaches at a place called Change Elemental that are really useful and wonderful and can give great advice. And they help a bunch of our staff, and they may be a place to start for resources to present to a team or a manager.
I think that's
there's
great.
Also one other thing, which is there's a training called the Choice Points training. That's our foundational training that I think is a really good first step for analyzing all of your internal systems and figuring out where you might do better.
Ooh, I love that. I'm going to have to grab that resource from you so we can share that. But I also wanted to add too, as an individual contributor, or to your point, like as a team member who wants to have a more diverse team, how do you like ask that legally? Something that we've seen that works really well is like that power of referral, to say like, hey, I went to this event with Power to Fly, and this company talked a lot about, hiring, all of these great, wonderful things about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, would you be interested in hearing more about like having an event like this, or, doing XYZ mentorship program, or all of these wonderful practices that companies are offering right now? I think that goes a really long way. So, talking about just ways and resources that we can kind of spread the good word of diversifying, referrals go such a long way.
We also, our managing director, who's been spearheading so much of this and who's a real genius around this stuff, is going to be speaking at a future summit that's specifically focused on diversity. And she'll be able to share, I see that Anna has asked about the anti-oppression practices. She'll be able to share more of the concrete resources. The truth is, we're doing it right now, making it the kind of thing we might be able to share more widely than just internally in the team. And that's a bit of where the field is. Like, we were looking for models, we couldn't find a ton of models. We're working on creating them with input, and then hopefully being able to share them out and getting feedback from other organizations about what's working for them.
I love that. And that is a great place for us to close this conversation. So thank you so much, Emma. This was a pleasure. I learned so much, and I need to go back and take notes listening to the recording. So thank you so much for being here. And quickly, can you let the audience know where they can find you, connect with you, learn more about Some of Us?
Yeah, we're at SumOfUs.org, and you can also email me at emma@SumOfUs.org. And I'd love to hear from you. And Lauren, you're an excellent interviewer, and this was super fun. So thank you.
Thank you. This was great. And I hope everyone checks out Emma and Some of Us, and I'm going to pass it off to Hunter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both so much. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Lauren. And thank all of you. Thank you for tuning in today. We had so many amazing speakers.